Poland, 1945. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Soviet and German forces clashed across villages, fields, and sacred grounds that had stood for centuries. In a small Benedictine convent near Poznan, 22 nuns lived in prayer and silence, their days measured by bells and devotion. They had survived 5 years of occupation, rationing, and the constant fear that came with living in a land torn between two brutal empires. But what came next would break them in ways no war manual ever described, in ways that no amount of faith could immediately heal. This is the story of Sister Maria Benedicta, a young woman who endured the unimaginable, carried her scars in silence for 3 decades, and then in 1975, faced the men who wore the same uniform as her tormentors. It is a story about pain that never fades, about the complexity of forgiveness, and about the strange, unexpected forms that reconciliation can take. March 1945. The winter had been brutal, but spring was beginning to break through the frozen ground. Sister Maria Benedicta knelt in the chapel, her hands folded in prayer, her lips moving silently through the rosary. She was 22 years old, her vows still fresh, taken only 2 years earlier in a ceremony that felt like a lifetime ago. Her faith was unshaken despite everything she had witnessed during the war. The convent had been her refuge, her fortress against the chaos outside. The other nuns were her sisters in every sense that mattered. Outside, beyond the stone walls, the sound of engines grew louder. Trucks, heavy vehicles grinding along the muddy road, boots on gravel, the sound that every civilian in occupied Poland had learned to fear. The Mother Superior, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, stood at the altar. Her face was pale but composed, her voice steady as she addressed the nuns. "Stay calm," she whispered. "They are just passing through. We have survived worse." But even as she spoke, her hands trembled slightly as they gripped her rosary. The doors burst open with a violence that shattered the sacred silence. Wehrmacht soldiers flooded the chapel, rifles raised, shouting in German. Their voices echoed off the vaulted ceiling, harsh and guttural. The nuns froze. Some clutched their rosaries so tightly their knuckles turned white. Others began to cry, soft whimpering sounds that seemed impossibly small in the vast space. Sister Agnieszka, only 16 years old and still a novice, grabbed Maria's hand. Her palm was slick with sweat. Maria squeezed back, trying to offer comfort even as her own heart hammered in her chest. Hauptmann Heinrich Weber stepped forward, his uniform crisp, despite the mud and chaos of retreat, his boots polished to a shine that seemed obscene in this holy place. He was a man in his mid-30s, his face hard and angular, his eyes cold and calculating as they scanned the room like a predator choosing prey. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no, who had never faced consequences for his actions. "You," he said in German, pointing directly at Sister Maria. "Come here. Now." His voice was not loud, but it carried absolute authority. Maria did not move. Her legs would not obey. Her body had turned to stone. She could feel every eye in the chapel on her, could hear the Mother Superior's sharp intake of breath. 2 soldiers stepped forward without hesitation, grabbed Maria by the arms, and dragged her toward the sacristy. Her feet scraped against the stone floor. The other nuns screamed, their voices finally breaking free from shock. Sister Agnieszka lunged forward, but another soldier shoved her back so hard she fell. The Mother Superior tried to intervene, stepping into Weber's path, but he simply pushed her aside with one hand. She stumbled, caught herself against a pew. Weber followed Maria into the sacristy, his boots echoing on the stone floor like a death march. Inside, he closed the door. The heavy wood muffled the sounds from the chapel. Maria found herself in the small room where the priests prepared for Mass, where sacred vessels were stored, where everything was supposed to be holy and safe. Weber looked at her with something that might have been curiosity, might have been contempt. What happened next, Maria would never speak of for 30 years. Not to the Mother Superior, not to the doctors who later examined her, not even to God in her most desperate prayers. The invasion lasted 3 days and 2 nights. The convent became a temporary base for retreating Wehrmacht units trying to regroup before the Soviet advance. Soldiers ransacked the library, tearing pages from centuries-old manuscripts to use as kindling for their fires. They burned vestments, used the chapel as a mess hall, cooked their rations on the altar itself. The smell of cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies filled spaces that had known only incense and cleanliness. Sister Maria and 5 other nuns were separated from the group, taken to the basement where the convent stored its winter provisions. They were interrogated, accused of hiding resistance messages, of sheltering partisans, of passing information to the Allies. None of it was true. The convent had remained faithful to teaching and prayer, had kept itself apart from the war as much as any place could. But truth did not matter to Weber. He conducted the interrogation sessions himself, not because he needed information, but because he needed to break them. He needed to exercise the power that was slipping away from him with every kilometer the front moved west. Maria was beaten with a rifle butt. She felt her ribs crack, heard the sound like dry branches snapping. Her jaw swelled until she could barely open her mouth. Blood filled her mouth, the taste of copper and salt. And then came the worst. She was violated repeatedly, by Weber, by others whose faces blurred together in her memory. Her body became a battlefield, a piece of territory to be conquered and destroyed. She lost track of time. Day and night became meaningless. There was only pain and the brief, merciful moments when she passed out. The other nuns suffered too. She could hear them crying through the walls. Sister Agnieszka's screams were the worst because she was so young, because her voice still had the high, clear quality of childhood. When the soldiers finally left, racing toward the collapsing front with Soviet forces only hours behind them, they left behind women who could barely stand. Maria crawled back to the chapel on her hands and knees, her habit torn and stained with blood and worse. She collapsed at the altar, her body shattered, her mind fracturing. Sister Agnieszka found her there. Despite her own injuries, despite her own trauma, she wrapped Maria in a blanket and held her as she wept. They stayed like that for hours, 2 broken girls clinging to each other in the ruins of their sanctuary. The war ended. Europe rebuilt. Churches were restored. Cities rose from rubble. Borders were redrawn. But for Maria, the war never stopped. Her body bore the scars that would never fully heal. Her pelvis had been damaged, the bones fractured in multiple places, the muscles torn. The doctors did what they could, but medical care in post-war Poland was primitive at best. Sitting became agony. Every meal, every prayer service, every moment of rest was a reminder of what had been done to her. The pain radiated from her hips down through her legs, up through her spine. Some days it was a dull ache. Other days it was sharp and blinding. She told no one outside the convent. The Mother Superior knew, of course. She had seen Maria's injuries, had helped clean and bandage her. So did Agnieszka, who had suffered her own violations, but whose body had healed more completely. But they did not speak of it. In those years in that place, silence was survival. Speaking about such things would have made them pariahs, would have brought shame not on the perpetrators but on the victims themselves. Maria transformed her pain into service. It was the only way she knew to survive. She worked in the garden, spending hours on her knees in the soil, planting vegetables that would feed the convent and the village. She taught children in the village school, patient and gentle even when her body screamed for rest. She cared for the sick, sitting beside deathbeds, offering comfort to the dying. She prayed for hours, her knees aching on the stone floor, her back bent until it felt like it would snap. She prayed for the dead, for the millions who had been consumed by the war. She prayed for the living, for those who were trying to rebuild. She even prayed for the men who had destroyed her because that is what her faith demanded. Jesus had said to forgive 70 times 7 times. He had said to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. But forgiveness? That was a word she could not yet pronounce. It stuck in her throat like broken glass. She could mouth the prayers, could say the words, but she could not feel them in her heart. And she wondered late at night when sleep would not come, if God was disappointed in her, if her inability to forgive meant her faith was weak, her soul corrupted. 30 years passed. Poland changed, though not always for the better. The Soviets replaced the Nazis, one occupation following another. The convent rebuilt its walls, repaired its roof, restored what could be restored. New nuns arrived, young women who knew the war only from stories their parents told, who had been born into a world already broken and were trying to build something better. Maria grew old. Her hair grayed, then whitened. Her hands developed arthritis. the joints swelling and stiffening. She moved more slowly, her limp becoming more pronounced. But the pain from her wartime injuries never left. If anything, it grew worse with age. "It hurts when I sit," she would say quietly, shifting uncomfortably in her chair during meals, trying to find a position that did not send lightning bolts of pain through her pelvis. The younger nuns did not understand. They thought it was arthritis, the natural deterioration of old age. They would offer her cushions, suggest she see a doctor. She would smile and thank them and say nothing more. Only Agnieszka knew. Only Agnieszka remembered. The two of them would sometimes sit together in the garden in the evening, not speaking, just existing in shared silence. They did not need to speak about it. The memory lived in their bodies, in the way they moved, in the way they flinched at sudden loud noises. 30 years after the war ended, a letter arrived at the convent, delivered by a young priest with an earnest face. It was from Father Tomasz Kowalski, newly assigned to the diocese, full of idealistic energy about healing and reconciliation. He was organizing a reconciliation event, part of a larger movement happening across Europe. Former Wehrmacht soldiers, now elderly men living quiet lives in West Germany, wanted to visit sites they had occupied during the war. They wanted to apologize, to offer reparations, to seek forgiveness from those they had harmed. Would the convent receive them? The letter was carefully worded, respectful, but it felt like a bomb had been dropped into their peaceful routine. The Mother Superior, a different woman now than the one who had led them during the war, read the letter aloud at dinner. The room fell silent. You could hear the scrape of forks on plates, the creak of the old building settling. Some nuns nodded slowly, their faces thoughtful. Forgiveness was central to their faith after all. Others looked away, uncomfortable, and some, the ones who had been there in 1945, went pale. Sister Maria said nothing. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white. She felt like she could not breathe, like the walls were closing in. Agnieszka, sitting beside her, placed a hand on her arm. The touch was warm, grounding. "You do not have to see them," she whispered. "You can stay in your cell. No one would judge you." Maria shook her head slowly. "If they come," she said, her voice barely audible, "I will be here." Agnieszka searched her face. Why? Maria did not have a good answer. Maybe because she needed to see them. Maybe because she needed to know if they were truly sorry, or if this was just another form of absolution seeking, a way to ease their own guilt without truly reckoning with what they had done. Maybe because some part of her, the part that still believed despite everything, thought that facing them might finally allow her to heal. 2 weeks later, on a gray morning in October, a bus arrived at the convent gate. 12 men stepped out, all in their 50s and 60s now, their hair gray or white, their faces lined with age. They wore simple clothes, dark suits or sweaters, carried no weapons, held no flags. They looked like grandfathers, like shopkeepers or teachers. It was almost impossible to imagine them in uniform, to imagine them as soldiers. Father Tomasz greeted them at the gate, shaking hands, his face bright with hope. The nuns stood in the courtyard, arranged in a semicircle, watching. Some of the younger nuns looked curious. The older ones looked guarded. Maria stood at the back, her face carefully blank, her hands hidden in her habit so no one could see them shaking. Agnieszka stood beside her, a silent pillar of support. The men approached slowly, their heads bowed, their steps hesitant. They looked nervous, uncertain. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes, stepped forward. His name was Klaus Zimmermann. He had been a sergeant in the Wehrmacht, stationed in this region in the final months of the war. He had been here in this convent in March 1945. He looked at the nuns, his eyes scanning their faces, and Maria saw the moment he recognized the place, saw the memories flood back. His eyes grew wet. He cleared his throat once, twice, struggling to speak. "I do not know if you remember me," he said in broken Polish, heavily accented but understandable. "But I remember you. I remember this place. I remember what we did here. I remember the screaming." His voice broke on the last word. "I remember standing outside and doing nothing to stop it. I am sorry." The words came out choked, desperate. "I am so sorry. I have lived with this for 30 years. I see your faces every night. I hear the screaming, and I did nothing." Maria felt her chest tighten. felt the air leave her lungs. She recognized him. Not his face exactly. The details had blurred with time, but his posture, his voice, the way he held himself. He had been there. He had stood outside the sacristy door. He had been one of the soldiers who guarded the entrance, who kept the other nuns from interfering. He had heard her screaming. He had heard all of them screaming. And he had done nothing. He had followed orders, had stood at his post, had been a good soldier. Agnieszka squeezed her hand hard enough to hurt. Maria took a breath, then another. She felt like she was moving through water as she stepped forward. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. The other nuns watched, wide-eyed. Father Tomasz looked like he might cry from the emotion of it all. Maria walked slowly, her limp visible, her body stiff with pain and tension. Each step was deliberate. Klaus saw her approach and his face went white. He recognized her too. She could see it in his eyes, the dawning horror, the recognition. "You," he whispered. "I remember you. You were the young one. The one they took first." Maria stopped a few feet away from him. She looked at him, really looked at him. This man who had once been a soldier, who had once stood by while she was destroyed, who now stood before her as a broken old man seeking absolution. He was crying now, openly, his shoulders shaking, not caring that everyone was watching. "Please," he said, his voice ragged. "Please forgive me. I was a coward. I was weak. I told myself I was just following orders, that I could not stop it, that I would be punished if I intervened. But the truth is, I was afraid. I was more afraid of my superiors than I was moved by your suffering. I have lived with this for 30 years. I see your face every night. I hear your screams. Please, I know I have no right to ask, but please." Maria said nothing for a long moment. She looked at this man, this stranger who knew her most intimate trauma, who had witnessed her destruction and done nothing. She felt anger, white-hot and righteous. She felt disgust. She felt a deep, aching sadness. But she also felt something else, something she had not expected. She felt tired, so tired of carrying this weight alone. "Do you know what you left behind?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Klaus nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Do you know that I have not been able to sit without pain for 30 years? That every single day, multiple times a day, I am reminded of what you and your comrades did to me? That I wake every morning, and the first thing I feel before I even open my eyes is the pain? That I have spent 3 decades trying to forgive and failing?" Klaus fell to his knees on the cobblestones. The sound was sharp, painful. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I know. I know. I cannot imagine it. But I know. I am sorry. I am so sorry." Maria looked down at him. She felt the weight of 30 years pressing on her chest, felt the accumulated pain of every difficult morning, every agonizing prayer service, every night she had lain awake wishing she could forget. "And still, you come here," she said. "Still, you ask for forgiveness. Why? Why now? Why after 30 years? Because I cannot live with it anymore," Klaus said, his voice breaking. "Because my own children are grown now, and I look at them and I think about what I stood by and let happen to someone else's child. Because I am dying. Cancer. The doctors give me maybe a year, and I cannot die with this on my soul. I need you to know that I see you, that I am sorry, that if I could undo it, I would give my life. I would trade places with you." Maria closed her eyes. She felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she had built to protect herself. She felt the pain of 30 years, but she also felt something new. Not forgiveness, not yet. She was not sure she would ever get there, but the possibility of it, the smallest crack in the armor around her heart. She opened her eyes. "Stand up," she said. Klaus looked up at her, disbelieving. "Stand up," she repeated. Klaus rose slowly, his knees protesting, his whole body trembling. Maria extended her hand. It hung in the air between them, small and weathered and marked by decades of work. Klaus stared at it like it was the most precious thing he had ever seen. Then, slowly, reverently, he took it. His grip was gentle, his hand warm. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." Maria shook her head. "I have not forgiven you," she said clearly. "I do not know if I ever will. But I see you. I see your remorse. And that is a start. That is more than I ever expected to have." The men stayed for 3 days. They worked from dawn until dusk. They repaired the chapel roof that had been leaking for years, replacing tiles and ceiling joints. They rebuilt the garden wall that had partially collapsed the previous winter. They cleaned and painted the schoolhouse where Maria taught. They donated money, a substantial amount collected from their congregation back in Germany, earmarked for medical care, for the convent's operations, for the village's needs. Klaus worked alongside the others, despite his illness. Maria would see him occasionally, hauling lumber or mixing mortar, his face drawn with effort and pain. He never approached her again, never tried to speak to her, respecting the boundary she had set. But sometimes their eyes would meet across the courtyard, and there would be a moment of acknowledgement, of shared understanding. Gerhard Müller worked harder than anyone. He was a carpenter by trade, his hands skilled and sure despite his age. He had been a young soldier in 1945, barely 19, conscripted and terrified. He barely spoke during the 3 days, just hammered nails and sawed wood, his face tight with shame and concentration. On the last day, as the sun was setting and the work was finished, he approached Sister Maria. She was sitting on a bench in the garden, her face drawn with pain after a long day of standing and supervising. He knelt beside her, his work-worn hands twisting his cap. "I was 19, he said quietly, not looking at her. "I was so scared. Every day I was scared. Scared of the Russians, scared of my officers, scared of dying. I wanted to stop them. I wanted to say something, but I did nothing. I was a coward. I am sorry." Maria looked at him, at this man who had been a boy, who had been caught up in something larger than himself. "You were a boy," she said. He shook his head violently. "I was a coward," he repeated. "Age does not excuse it." Maria was silent for a moment, thinking about all the young men who had been fed into the machinery of war, who had been turned into perpetrators or victims or both. "You are here now," she said finally. "You are doing something now. That is not nothing." Gerhard bowed his head. "Thank you, sister. Thank you for saying that. I do not deserve it, but thank you." That evening, the men gathered in the chapel for a final prayer service. Father Tomasz led it, his voice ringing with conviction as he spoke about reconciliation, about healing, about the grace of God that could bridge any divide. The nuns sat on one side of the chapel, the men on the other. Maria sat in the front row, her body tense despite the cushion someone had thoughtfully placed on the pew. Klaus sat directly across from her. Their eyes met. He nodded, a small gesture of respect and gratitude. She nodded back, acknowledging him. Father Tomasz spoke beautifully about forgiveness, about how it freed both the forgiver and the forgiven, about how it was the ultimate act of faith, but Maria barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, traveling back through 30 years, thinking about all the faces she remembered and all the faces she had tried to forget. She was thinking about Hauptmann Heinrich Weber. He was not here. He would never be here. According to records she had seen years later, he had died on the Eastern Front, shot by a Soviet sniper just weeks after leaving the convent. He had never faced justice. He had never apologized. He had never even known that his actions had consequences beyond the immediate. There would be no apology from him, no reparation, no closure. And yet, these men were here. Not Weber, not the ones who had hurt her most directly, but men who had stood by, men who had been silent when they should have spoken, men who had followed orders when they should have rebelled, men who now, decades later, chose to speak, to acknowledge, to try in some small way to make amends. Was that enough? Maria did not know. She genuinely did not know. But it was something. It was more than she had ever expected to receive. After the service, as the others filed out into the cool evening air, Klaus approached her one last time. He held out an envelope, thick and heavy. Inside was money, Deutsche Marks converted to Polish currency, enough to cover years of medical treatment, physical therapy, medications. "For your pain," he said simply, "so you can sit more comfortably, so maybe the last years of your life can have less suffering than the first." Maria stared at the envelope. Her first instinct was to refuse, to throw it back at him, to tell him that money could not buy forgiveness, could not undo what had been done. But then she thought of the other nuns, the younger ones who had nothing to do with the war, who were trying to keep the convent running on almost nothing. She thought of the leaking roof and the crumbling walls and the endless needs. She took the envelope. Thank you, she said. Klaus nodded. I will pray for you every day, he said. For whatever time I have left, I will pray for you. Maria looked at him, at this dying man seeking peace before the end. And I will pray for you, she said. Not for your comfort, but for your soul, that you find whatever you are looking for. Klaus smiled sadly. That is more than I deserve, he said. Much more. The bus left early the next morning. The nuns stood at the gate, waving as it pulled away. Most of them were smiling, moved by the experience, by the demonstration of faith and reconciliation. Father Tomasz was beaming, already planning to write about this for the diocesan newsletter. Maria did not wave. She stood apart from the others, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Agnieszka stood beside her, as she always did. Do you feel better? She asked quietly. Maria shook her head. No, but I feel something. What? Maria thought for a long moment, watching the bus disappear down the road. Hope, she said finally. Maybe. I feel like maybe it is possible to move forward. Not to forget. Never to forget. But to carry it differently. Agnieszka smiled, the first real smile Maria had seen on her face in days. That is enough, she said. That is more than enough. The years passed. Klaus Zimmermann died in 1976, less than a year after his visit. His widow sent a letter to the convent, thanking them for receiving him, for giving him peace in his final months. Maria attended a memorial mass for him, praying for his soul as she had promised. Gerhard Müller continued to send money every Christmas, small amounts that he could afford, always with a note that said simply, thank you. The convent thrived with the donations, able to repair buildings and expand its school. Maria continued teaching, continued praying, continued living with her pain, but something had shifted. The weight was still there, but it was distributed differently. She was no longer carrying it alone. Sister Maria Benedicta died in 1989, at the age of 66. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her sisters. After her death, while cleaning out her cell, the nuns found her journal. She had kept it sporadically over the years, writing when the pain was too much or when she needed to process something. In it, she had written about the visit from the German soldiers. The entry was dated November 1975, written late at night by candlelight. She wrote, Today I did something I never thought I would do. I looked into the eyes of a man who stood by while I was destroyed, and I did not turn away. I did not forgive him. I do not know if I ever will. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It is not a decision you make once. It is something you choose every day, and some days you cannot choose it. But I saw him. I saw his shame. I saw his sorrow. I saw that he had carried this weight too in his own way, and I chose not to turn away. Perhaps that is what forgiveness is. Not forgetting, not erasing, not saying that what happened was acceptable, but seeing, acknowledging, and choosing, despite everything, to let a small light in, to not let the darkness have the final word. The journal entry ended with a single line, written in a slightly different hand as if added later. It still hurts when I sit, but I am no longer alone in the pain. This is the story of Sister Maria Benedicta, a woman who survived the unimaginable, a woman who carried her pain for 30 years in silence, a woman who, when faced with the men who had failed her, chose not vengeance, but the hard, fragile work of being seen and seeing in return. Her story reminds us that reconciliation is not simple, that forgiveness is not weakness, and that healing is not forgetting. It reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to remain open to the possibility of grace, even when everything in us wants to close off. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. History is not just about the past. It is about how we choose to face it, how we choose to carry it, and how we choose to move forward.